Okay, so welcome. I'm glad to have y'all here today. My name is Christine. I think it is now officially after 11, so I am late, which if you know me, that stands right on target right there. So today we're going to be talking about the Civil Air Patrol during World War II. This presentation was very much, oh, no. I had it working. Some of you were in here when I tested it and had it working nicely. There we go. So this presentation was inspired by an exhibit that we did at the Maritime Museum probably about 6 years ago or so, talking about the Coastal Air Patrol during World War II. And I was very much surprised by how few people actually knew about the Civil Air Patrol's early involvement in World War II and what they did off of North Carolina's coast. So my goal with this presentation is very much to highlight what they did and some of the amazing feats they had and let you know they were there and they were not just sitting around. I think one of the nicknames they had were just being draft dodgers or country club pilots. They were doing a lot of good out there. But before we dive too far into that, I do want to mention the fact that this lecture is part of the Maritime Heritage Lecture Series given by the North Carolina Maritime Museum. This is a series of lectures that occur on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Not every Thursday, but most Thursdays throughout the year. Our next two lectures coming up are going to be on May 23rd about sea turtles of North Carolina. That'll be presented by our natural science curator, Keith Rittmaster. And then on May 29th, not that I'm not excited about sea turtles, but I'm really excited about May 29th. So this is A Curiosity Grows in Carolina. This will be a new topic for our lecture series. This is going to be presented by Shannon out of the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Southport. She's going to come up from Southport for us. And what she's talking about is the Venus flytrap and a lot of the historical, for lack of a better term, drama that goes on around this plant from its discovery up through today. So really, I'm excited to see it and I'm excited to be able to share that with you. But today, we're here to talk about the Civil Air Patrol. Now, the men and women of the Civil Air Patrol during World War II would ultimately be about 80,000 bodies strong. Now, this is all up and down the coast, not just here in North Carolina, with members spending about $1 million of their own personal money to help support the Coastal Patrol. And they would fly a total of 64,000 hours during just the first 5 months of 1943. So in 5 months, their staff would do 64,000 hours. To put this in perspective, in that same time period, the Army would fly 27,000 hours and the Navy 72,000 hours. Now, Civil Air Patrol is made up entirely of civilians, so those are some pretty impressive numbers. By the end of their service, the sub-chasers, that division, would log more than 24 million miles from 21 coastal patrol bases, reporting 173 suspected subs and attacking 57 subs. Nationally, these wartime volunteers would fly a total of 750,000 hours in 86,685 different missions. Air crews would report, in addition to the work with the sub reporting, air crews would also end up reporting 91 vessels in distress, rescue 363 survivors at sea, recover the remains of 36 people, and perform 5,684 special convoy missions at the request of the Navy. The Manteo and Beaufort bases here in North Carolina would patrol approximately 9,200 hours, logging those hours in from September 1942 to August 1943. Each base would fly over 1 million miles of patrols during their existence. And to really make this impressive, they did that in the span of about 17 months. So the Civil Air Patrol would come into existence around December 1st, and the sub-chasers would come into existence around March 1942. So in the space of 17 months, they accomplished all of this. Unfortunately, the CAP operations were classified as confidential military information, and violators or anybody that would actually share information could be prosecuted under what was called the Espionage Act. And although the military did acknowledge the existence of the base, they very rarely shared any information about them. So at the time, very few people knew about what was going on these bases, the service that these men and women were performing. And then even since then, that information has only started to trickle out in bits and pieces. So I'm very excited to be able to share them with you. By mid-July 1942, the commander of all the Nazi U-boats would withdraw his last submarines from America's coast after increasing losses and reduced success against merchant traffic. He would actually cite the Civil Air Patrol planes as being one of the factors for his decision to pull those submarines. He would refer to them as those verdamped yellow planes. I don't need to translate that word, I imagine, for everybody. So German U-boats, going into the history of this, so even prior to World War II, there were already plans going on that would cause the creation of the Civil Air Patrol or Coastal Air Patrol. German U-boats were the first to actually started showing up on America's coast even before America officially joined World War II, because they wanted to investigate our coastline to see if there are any weaknesses. And they immediately found that the East Coast had the potential to be what they termed prime hunting grounds for merchant vessels transporting goods to and from America. This is largely due to the geography of North Carolina. They also identified North Carolina's coast as being another prime hunting ground. The waters off North Carolina, particularly Cape Hatteras, would become a prime hunting ground for U-boats. The water formed a natural choke point, and merchant traffic heading north and south would have to swing out from the Cape to avoid the treacherous diamond shoals, placing them right near the continental shelf, which is what you can see right here, coming close to us. Now, the frying pan shoals off Cape Fear and Lookout shoals off of Cape Lookout also became graveyards for numerous U-boat victims. But long before submarine warfare commenced off Cape Hatteras, the North Carolina coast had already acquired the nickname Graveyard of the Atlantic for the number of ships that had already run aground of these shoals. So this is already, because of our geography, a dangerous place for merchant vessels to go back and forth on. And now we're adding in U-boats. So the U-boats already saw the potential here. Now, the continental shelf was a great advantage to them because during the day they could go off the continental shelf, dive deep, be out of range of any depth charge or sightings for technology at the time, and then at night come up and go ahead and hit those merchant vessels that were going up and down the coast. Early on, they had a huge advantage because as they were coming up from the continental shelf, they would be able to see the silhouette of many of those vessels highlighted by the lights of the coast, because North Carolina was unfortunately resistant to blackout protocols till much later. So we see a lot of those vessels being hit. Fortunately, the Germans were not the only ones thinking ahead. There were a lot of great civilians here in the States that were also thinking ahead. Gil Rob Wilson is one of them. Gil Rob Wilson was a veteran aviator from World War I, editor of the New York Herald Tribune aviation page, president of the National Aeronautics Association, and director of the New Jersey Bureau of Aviation. I mention all that to show that he has a very extensive background in both military and aeronautics. He is a very experienced man. And he foresaw the use of the nation's civilian aviation resources for war following a visit to Germany in 1936. Following his visit to Germany, he saw all the preparations they were making. Then he came back to the United States and saw none of the preparations we weren't making. And he really started to use his place with the Aeronautics Association as their president to start pushing this idea that civilian aircraft could help fill in the gap off of our coast, or even on our coast inland as well, helping with different emergencies. So he started as early as 1936, all the way through 1940, really pushing this plan that he had made about how to use civilian aircraft to help secure our coast and our inland areas. September 1, 1939, just as Gil Rob Wilson had predicted, World War II would officially begin. Obviously, America would not be involved in it at that point, officially not involved in that at that point, I should say. And then we see on May 20th, 1941, even though America was not officially involved in the World War II yet, there was still recognition amongst the government that we needed to start taking some steps in case this were to come to our shores. And one of those steps was the creation of the Office of Civilian Defense. It was a United States federal emergency war agency that was set up to coordinate state and federal measures for protection of civilians in case of war emergencies. Its two branches supervise protective functions such as blackouts, special fire protection, and war service functions such as childcare, health, housing, and transportation. This is something that a lot of people that have those firsthand memories or were here on coastal North Carolina would definitely have memories of having to go through the blackout protocols. I think we were just talking about that earlier. More importantly, for the purpose of our presentation, this is also the organization that would create the Civil Air Patrol officially on December 1st, 1941. On December 1st, 1941, LaGuardia was named the first head of the Office of Civilian Defense. And just like my husband asked, yes, that LaGuardia of the airport, LaGuardia. But most importantly, LaGuardia announced the establishment of the Civil Air Patrol with Major General John F. Curry serving as the first national commander, and civilian defense officials defined the CAP, which was placed under the control of the National Office of Civil Defense Headquarters as an organization of civilian aviation resources of the nation for national defense service. So what he had created was, so we have the Office of Civil Defense. This is a series of civilians directed by some government officials to help enforce different measures such as the blackout protocols and the daycares and such during the potential effects of the war. Then we have the Civil Air Patrol being created over there by LaGuardia. And he said that he recognized the potential and value of bringing in those aircraft for different services. He will officially start with having them just serve purposes such as courier services, helping to move around military personnel in some situations, and then fighting fires. Forest fires became a big part of their mission. Just less than a week after the creation of the Civil Air Patrol, we have the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, which would then trigger the entering of America into World War II on December 8th, 1941. Just helping to kind of put everything in perspective here. So December 1, 1941, Civil Air Patrol came into existence under the Office of Civilian Defense. December 8th, 1941, America enters the war. And on December 30th, very quick turnaround, the North Carolina wing here in North Carolina of the Civil Air Patrol hosted their first meeting to try and recruit new members of the newly created North Carolina wing. Now, this was held at the in the Manteo room of the Sir Walter Raleigh Hotel in Raleigh. As I was mentioning to some people earlier, a lot of times when I study history, I tend to study significantly earlier time periods where I'm dependent on paintings and not photographs. So I was so excited when I found actual photographs of the meeting room where this meeting took place. So in this room, Civil Air Patrol leaders explained the intention of the Civil Air Patrol. The initial meeting had 60 aviators who had come for the meeting. They described the state wing and their plan to compose it of 3 groups headquartered in Charlotte. They emphasized to the audience that this service would be on a purely voluntary basis and did not carry a draft deferment. I mentioned this because unfortunately, later on, the Civil Air Patrol members would unfortunately get a reputation for being draft dodgers, which they weren't, because there was no draft deferment for being involved in this. And then members would receive some pay from either the state or federal government for their time and use of equipment. So if they brought like their own personal planes with them, they could receive some payment, but only during times that they were engaged in emergency services such as patrol or courier duty. So if they were in between different duties or different jobs. They weren't getting paid for just sitting around the hangar or doing any number of those other duties that might not be considered emergency services. The state wing staff worked to organize, recruit, and train the pilots, observers, mechanics, ground crew, and other volunteers. And by the end of January 1942, so just a little over a month later, over a quarter of the civilian pilots in North Carolina would submit enlistment paperwork for the Civil Air Patrol because they were also interested in helping to support this organization. The wing would number approximately 350 members and over 100 aircraft at that at this first wave. They would be able, because of the numbers, they would be able to establish squadrons in Asheville, Burgar, Charlotte, Elizabeth City, Fayetteville, Gastonia, Hickory, Raleigh, Wilson, and a few other areas. So all across the state, we see these Civil Air Patrol bases popping up. Obviously, we're going to be focusing on the coastal ones, but I did want to highlight the fact that they are all over the state. In addition to sea rescues from 1941 to 1944, North Carolina volunteer aviators served in the state wing of the CAP, towing targets for military training, performing courier services, and fighting forest fires. Obviously, the most prominent and the one we're here to talk about today, mission that they were involved in was their anti-submarine patrol duties. But I do want to give a shout out to one of their most famous fires. Shouldn't call it a famous fire. That's being heartless there. But one of their first missions would involve them. There we go. On April 24th to 26, 1942, the Civil Air Patrol would be pulled in to help assist with the forest fire, the state wing at, okay, I gotta make sure I say this right, Pisgah National Forest. And the North Carolina wing would ferry officers of the state's National Guard to the vicinity while also carrying Rangers of the U.S. Service for observation. CAP aircraft were reported by the Raleigh News as having the duty of flying low over the mountains, spotting new blazes, and reporting developments in the control efforts being made by more than 700 workers. So a very key role to helping fight this forest fire. This was something that I learned about and I thought was really an interesting fun fact. And in 1944, so starting at the beginning of World War II and even a little before, there was a significant concern about forest fires. If the war or battles did come to our coast, there could be the fact that terrorists is what we would call them today, but spies could come in, infiltrate, and set these forest fires and set fires up and down the coast or across the nation. So they started organizing and doing their best to find a new network of ways of preventing and fighting forest fires. In 1944, they unveiled their newest Smokey the Bear mascot here to help perpetuate the idea that only you can prevent forest fires and to really get that message out to the public. So Smokey the Bear is a World War II result. 1944, he comes out. Initially, he didn't have pants on, then they put pants on him because I think people were like, he needs to be covered up a little bit. But I think it was about 1950, there was a young bear cub that was the only survivor from a massive forest fire in Lincoln National Forest. And he was later moved to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., where he was considered the living embodiment of Smokey the Bear. So just a little awe moment there for you. But back onto, figured we'd take a little break from so we're back to World War II. So when America officially entered World War II on December 8th, 1941, they triggered a secret German plan codenamed Operation Drumbeat for a submarine assault on the American eastern seaboard. This is what I had alluded to earlier in the presentation, where the Germans had been already investigating our eastern seaboard and found it to be a prime hunting ground. Their strategy was to take advantage of the poor American war preparations and strike at the vulnerable merchant-rich sea lanes just off of the Atlantic coast. When filled with extra fuel and supplies, German U-boats could patrol the East Coast for up to 2 to 3 weeks at a time. When the U-boats first arrived to the East Coast, they actually found they described the conditions as almost exactly identical to those of normal peacetime. There were no coastal blackouts being reinforced. Shipping followed normal routes. Merchantmen frequently signaled their position by radio, and the U.S. Armed Forces lacked the ships and planes to counter the U-boat threat. So they found those prime hunting grounds still in place. They found them to be very fruitful. The favored targets of U-boat crews were obviously the giant oil tankers, because these would have been supplies that were vital to the Allied war effort. In the first 3 months of 1942, so the beginning of this Operation Drumbeat, we would see the number of tankers sunk would be 4 times the number built in America in that same time period. So very quick. By July 1942, nearly 400 merchant vessels would be sunk with over 3 million tons of materials on board. In that same period, we would only successfully sink 8 U-boats. The U.S. Navy quickly deemed the East Coast of the United States as the most dangerous area for merchant shipping in the world. Not exactly a reputation anybody wants. By March of 1942, insurance companies actually refused to cover merchant vessels traveling to the United States coast, and the oil companies were up in arms about the amount of ships and merchandise being lost. Visitors to North Carolina's coast are often surprised to learn just how close these attacks were coming to shore. By June 1942, we know that U-boats had already sunk around 397 merchant vessels. And on top of being the graveyard of the Atlantic, a nickname we previously already had, we had now inherited we had earned the nickname Torpedo Junction as a result of the number of ships being sunk. One of the examples of how close these ships were coming is the story of the USS Roper from April 1942. On April 14, 1942, the destroyer USS Roper discovered U-85 running on the surface of the coast of North Carolina near Cape Hatteras. After U-85 had been hit by a 3-inch shell and 50 caliber gunfire, the captain decided to scuttle the boat. Ultimately, the whole crew from that U-boat would pass away, and according to local oral history, when that crew was recovered from that U-boat, they found in the pockets, and they found that many of the crew members were wearing civilian clothes, and in their pockets they had American currency, as well as security cards, draft cards, and other documents needed for living and working in the United States. It's largely believed that this U-boat was planning to make a landing here in North Carolina to put these crew onto shore to ultimately infiltrate America. That's just how close these U-boats and how successful they were off of our coast. Sorry, I don't have a picture to go with this one very well. But Carl Swain, who was a native of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and a radio operator at the Civil Air Patrol Base 16, recalls witnessing a U-boat attack, and this is his own words here, which really helps to illustrate what it was like being on the coast at that time period. He said, "I stood in the old casino at Nag's Head one night in the winter time when it was cold, and I saw one of those tankers right close to shore go up just like a firecracker. And you could see the men flying out of it and the oil burning on top of the water. I thought I saw 2 or 3 blow up just standing there. I mean, we were just standing there talking, looking out the window. People don't realize how hot the enemy action was here. And the Coastal Patrol did a world of good." So really imagine standing at a casino or at a gaming hall and just looking out the window watching this. Then we have Dorothy Graham Westcott of Edgefield, South Carolina. She was also working in the Civil Air Patrol Base 16 and recalls another U-boat attack, different one. "When we first got down to Manteo, we could see ships burning off the coast every night. You couldn't walk on the beaches out around Nag's Head for the litter from the ships that had been torn apart, from the cases of fruit and the cases of vegetables that had come in from the ships, and the sailor's hat and all these things. You could not walk on the beach anywhere in Dare County at that time. And the people who've never experienced this and have never been told the story of this do not realize how close that war was to our shores. We hated to see moonlit nights. And as pretty as the ocean is when it shimmers and sparkles, because we knew that the moonlight silhouetted the ships for the U-boats. Imagine dreading the moonlight because you knew what it was going to bring." She's not actually in that picture. That was just a great picture I had of some women from the Civil Air Patrol to help illustrate. So the first U-boats would officially arrive. Off of North Carolina's coast on January 16, 1942. Even and then that first German submarine would be identified as U-66, and it would actually arrive off the coast of Cape Hatteras. We know it arrived on January 16th officially, because since the war, Germans were very good about keeping records, and they have shared that with us, so we're able to look at their own logbooks and figure out where they were and when they were, where they were. So we know this U-boat arrived on the 16th. On the night of January 18th, the U-boat would spot the Standard Oil of New Jersey-owned tanker Alan Jackson, and it'd sink it with 2 torpedoes, killing 22 of the crew of 35, marking the first boat to be sunk as part of off of North Carolina's coast as part of this Operation Drumbeat. It would sink with 2 torpedoes, killing, like I said, 22 of the crew of 35. By the end of January, now mind you, this is January 18th this occurred. By the end of January, an additional 8 Allied vessels would go down off of North Carolina's coast, including the British tanker Empire Gem with a loss of 49 crew members. And in February, German U-boats would sink 8 more ships along the state's coast and destroyed another 22 in March and another 23 in April. This is a graphic that was made by my exhibits department. I know it's a little fuzzy right here, but each of these red triangles represents one of the ship's merchant vessels that we know of that was sunk off of our coast, just to give you a feel for how close it was coming to our coast and how effective they were. Ultimately, the U-boats would sink 78 vessels off the North Carolina coast. Military officials in the early months of 1942 tried to calm public fears, because obviously coastal residents were very aware of what was going on, as I described in those words. They could see the carnage coming up on the shore. They could see the ships burning off of the coast, but they were dealing with a shocking lack of preparedness to combat these submarines. That's really a dramatic one there. As U-boat attacks on the tankers persisted, outrage over the tanker loss prompted the Tanker Committee, the Tanker Committee of the Petroleum War Council to meet with both the Navy and War Department in February and early March of 1942. At the meeting, the Tanker Committee actually suggested that the Civil Air Patrol add a new responsibility or a new mission to their plate, which would be to conduct patrols to locate German U-boats. The Navy initially rejected the idea. However, the Army Air Force expressed no objection. The biggest obstacle to this plan was a lack of funding, and this is something that'll stay persistent throughout the Civil Air Patrol or Coastal Patrol's existence. Oil companies were so desperate for any kind of relief from this loss that they would agree to fund the first 2 months of operations of experimental bases, of coastal patrol bases that would be up in the New Jersey area. And they would initially provide $18,000, which when calculated for today is about $300,000. So imagine the oil companies just handing over $300,000. They were quite desperate to have this end, to save their ships, obviously. The first experimental Coastal Air Patrol base would be in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and would prove so successful that the program would be adopted before the completion of the trial period. Who are we talking about is in the Civil Air Patrol, or who's serving in the Coastal Air Patrol? From teenagers in high school, you could be as young as 16 and enlist in the Coastal Air Patrol, and then we saw all the way up to older family men. The Civil Air Patrol members were all volunteers. They did not, like I said earlier, they did not receive a draft deferment, and they received very little compensation for their services. Pilots would receive $8 a day, but they were required to pay for their own uniforms, food, and lodging, and payment was often delayed and could take as long as 2 months to receive. Members consisted of both men and women from all walks of life, and the only requirement beyond being over 16 for membership was that you were a U.S. citizen and you had to be be willing to be subject to a cursory FBI background check. You did not have to have a background in aviation. Training was given to you on that. The activities of CAP were considered, once again, like I mentioned, secret and protected by the Espionage Act. Therefore, CAP rarely received the accolades or media attention that it deserved for what it was doing. Consequently, the public did not understand the role of CAP, and at the time, out of ignorance, they would very often refer to CAP members, as I mentioned, as country club pilots and draft dodgers. But nothing could be further from the truth. Their ranks included not only ordinary men and women, but some pretty prominent figures. I won't name them specifically, but we had amongst them, we saw quite a few prominent figures that put their careers on hold. So, for example, we saw a Hollywood director and a world famous pianist. One of the members would serve as or act as a munchkin for the Wizard of Oz. We saw a sitting state governor serve for the Civil Air Patrol, Wall Street financier. But what I want, and pioneering African-American female aviator, future Tuskegee Airman, the head of a major brewery, and the founder of a famous donut chain. He would actually come to serve here in North Carolina. He would put on hold his career, his new company that would later be known as Krispy Kreme, to serve the Civil Air Patrol, or the Coastal Air Patrol. So we see a lot of different people represented. Notably, Civil Air Patrol did serve as a pioneering opportunity for the nation's women to serve the nation in uniform. More than half of the women's Air Force service pilots, also known as WASP, would serve in the Civil Air Patrol during some part of the war. And so did many of the members of the Women's Army Corps, the Women's Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Services, also known as WAVES, and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. By 1944, 1 in 4 members of the Civil Air Patrol was a woman, and they were actually flying very important inland missions. So they served, so it's pretty cool that we see all different types, and we see different opportunities. In 1942, the Civil Air Patrol was predominantly, so what are they flying is a lot of questions I get too. A whole mishmash of stuff, because obviously the military is not really supplying this. This is a lot of civilian supplied planes. But what we're seeing in 1942 is they're predominantly flying light fabric skinned aircraft with unreliable engines and basic instrumentation. We're looking at altimeters, compass, turn and bank indicators, and a radio. Due to wartime restrictions, many of the necessary engine parts were difficult to obtain, so mechanics and ground crews had to find inventive ways of keeping the aircraft operational. The planes of the sub-chasers were specifically painted red and yellow, like you're seeing in this image here, with special markings on the side, a blue circle with a white triangle to identify them as Civil Air Patrol aircraft. Patrols were conducted up to 60 miles offshore, generally with 2 planes flying together. Flights were made daily despite the weather and in all seasons, including the winter, when ditching, which was especially risky because if they had to ditch an aircraft in those cold seas, it could mean almost certain death for the air crew. Emergency equipment early on was very lacking. In the early periods, they document taking inner tubes and duck hunting vests out, and that was all they had as flotation devices. But then later on, they were fortunately supplied with ocean-worthy wetsuits, life vests, and official life rafts. But early on, they were very risky. During World War II, we see a lot of the Coastal Air Patrol. They would fly primarily with practice bombs, smoke bombs, more about a way of looking visually deterring so that if a U-boat did spot them, they would think they had a real bomb on them. But we do know that later they would be armed with bombs similar to what you're seeing up here, 100-pound demolition bombs. Pilots would aim their bombs using homemade bomb sights made out of nothing but the best hairpins, which they swore were very reliable and accurate up to 3,000 feet to their target. Beginning in May, Army technicians actually began officially fitting bomb racks to enable the civilian aircraft to carry the bombs. While at Base 16, I have a great description. Weldon Fields, a native of Greensboro, North Carolina, and the CAP communication officer recalled that arming of the base's Stinson 109 Voyagers, the plane's bomb racks were installed in Norfolk, Virginia, and a 4-man Army ordnance crew was present at the Base 16 to arm the aircraft. They would put 40 gallons of gas, plus these 100-pound bombs strapped to the belly of the Stinson Voyager. And it may, as he described it, it may take off slow and precarious at their very short runways. And I love this image because it really gives you a perspective on how large these bombs really were. And then I wish I could show you one right next to the plane because they're not very big planes and they're exceptionally big bombs. We do know in North Carolina there is one documented time of them using one of these bombs. On August 20th, 1943, a patrol out of the Manteo Civil Air Patrol Base number 16, consisting of pilots Rhonda Story and Howard Thompson, spotted a submarine at 8:35 in an area about 20 miles off Cape Hatteras. As they would fly around the sighting, the submarine, they would initially see the submarine, it would fail to notice them, and then as they got closer to it, it would actually sink down. 6 minutes later, when the plane had it would submerge itself as they approached it, leaving a swirling water and a slight of oil behind it. I mention this because they will repeatedly say that all they see of this submarine is swirling water and a slight of oil slick. They observed what appeared to be the outline of a deck and conning tower beneath the water. So the Civil Air Patrol crews actually dropped a single bomb, one of those 100-pound bombs, off of their plane, and it failed to detonate. They tried. Aircraft and vessels of the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard converged on the location and commenced searching for the submarines. They weren't able to find it. Over 2 hours later, there was a whole kerfuffle out near Elizabeth City where they believed they had also found this submarine. They had also dropped a number of bombs on it, only to discover after the war, when historians started researching German records, that there was no U-boat within 500 miles of the coast at that time. So what it is believed is that there's two theories as to what they were firing on. Could be a whale, but these men would have been very familiar with the local wildlife. These are North Carolinians, or it could have been a vessel, specifically the Papoose, which was torpedoed and sunk just earlier on March 19th, and it may have drifted, and they may have drifted and would have caused a navigational aid or hindrance. So they claim that they still served a purpose by destroying it and preventing it from being a navigational aid. Both men would receive the Air Medal for their service, despite the later epiphany that it was not actually a U-boat. I do want to mention during World War II, Colonel Frank Dawson was the commander of the North Carolina wing here in, obviously, North Carolina, and of the coastal patrol bases. He was instrumental in the founding of the bases in Manteo and in Beaufort, and he was the direct commander, ultimately, of the Beaufort base. One airman characterized Colonel Dawson as firm but friendly and fair, and he would go on to say that he was our commander. Lieutenant Colonel Frankie Dawson, we felt that Base 21 was our base, but it was the major, as he was respectively known by all of us, who made the base possible. Dawson would go on. I have a laundry list of different sources of money that he was able to go out and fundraise and pull together to help make these bases everything they ultimately came to be. They went from being grass, marshland to being beautiful bases, and the airport and ultimately later on they would transform into some of our modern airports or present day airports. So the first base that Dawson would found in North Carolina would be base number 16 at Saco, which later would move to Manteo. So that's why it's kind of two names there. During June and July of 1942, the first North Carolina Coastal Patrol Base came into existence. Dawson reported on July 21st that the base could begin operation the following day, and despite the program's extremely limited funding, an advanced group of men arrived at Saco to prepare the new CAP, or Coastal Patrol Base number 16. This group of 16 men and 1 woman were led by Base Commander Dawson and Charlotte Engineer CAP Captain James L. Hamilton, and they commenced cleaning up the base headquarters, also known as an old farmhouse, mowing the fields, clearing the brush, erecting a radio antenna and battling swarms of mosquitoes. They said that this was their first main battle in the Coastal Air Patrol. The Technical Sergeant Dorothy Graham of Raleigh recalled, in her words, she stated, "When our linemen went out to service planes at the Manteo base, they'd have to wear mosquito netting over all exposed parts of their bodies in order to tolerate the bugs. The men often told jokes about how big the mosquitoes were and what they would say to each other, like, 'Shall we eat him here or drag him off into the swamps for later?' Despite the challenging work and swarms of mosquitoes, 80 Tar Heels at the base, they had their jobs, and the base commander ran a very strict operation. The local community and Dawson tirelessly lobbied the state government for funding, and they were able to get a lot of infrastructure built thanks to Dawson and the local community. Manteo's citizens readily accepted the Civil Air Patrol men and women with open arms, renting out houses and rooms to them, interacting with them at base. We saw, I found documentation of at least a couple of barbecues that they all kind of had together. So we see the community really rising up to be part of them. For unknown reasons, we know that Dawson came into the base to check on its progress on September 15th. It's not documented as far as I can tell anywhere, but immediately afterwards, Hamilton would reside as commander of the Manteo base, and Dawson would put in place a new gentleman, Captain Allen H. Watkins Jr., who would actually quickly earn the respect and admiration of his peers as a base commander, and then he would immediately move the base from the Saco Airport all the way up to the new airport that was just built north of the town of Manteo, which is where it would stay for the remainder of its career. So hence the Saco and Manteo name. With the base at Manteo officially established, Major Dawson decided to start working on obtaining a second base for North Carolina. He informed the governor on August 5th, 1942, that he was working to acquire another coastal patrol base. Despite the fact that the men, he made a point to mention, "I'm going to try and get this new base, despite the fact that you guys haven't paid my men at Manteo their per diem from the Army." So Coastal Air Patrol Base 21 in Beaufort, North Carolina was established officially on September 7th, 1942, and was the last coastal air patrol base to be activated during World War II. Beaufort was considered a great location because it was halfway between Cape Fear and Cape Hatteras, and furthermore, Beaufort was the only location east of New Bern that had a field large enough to accommodate the planes and their needed runways. The conditions at Base 21 were no easier than those at Base 16. The field was overgrown, prone to flooding, and the mosquitoes were once again terrible. The only permanent structure on that property at the time was an old farmhouse. And when they arrived at the coast, they immediately began organizing the base along with 70. So Dawson brought 75 volunteers initially from the Civil Air Patrol, and they immediately started preparing it. They would mow their runways right out of the grass. They would fly from grass fields out of marshlands. At high tide, the fields would flood with several inches of water, concealing the many potholes that would occur on the runway and make flight operations difficult. Dawson would lobby for much more funding and ultimately would become very successful with it. Despite the hard conditions of the field, volunteers would mow out 2 long runways through marsh grass on the highest ground available, fill in the holes as much as they could, level the ground as best they could. The men would ultimately erect a radio tower, configure a cottage into a base operation office, construct primitive outhousing, and build a pilot's house from lumber that was brought over from Williamston. After all the construction check flights and radio checks, the first patrol lifted off on September 30th. So despite all of the conditions that they walked in on, they had that base up and running by the 30th, less than a month later. Much like Manteo, Beaufort's community warmly welcomed the CAP community, also renting out rooms and cottages to the aviators. And we do know of at least a couple marriages that ultimately came to be between Civil Air Patrol members based in Beaufort and the local community. Dawson wasted no time upgrading the base. He would, like I said, go out and he would lobby for the money. And thanks to Dawson's success in fundraising, by late July 1943, so less than a year later, Beaufort would end up sporting a massive new hangar, 2 4,000-foot runways, machine shops, and then Manteo itself would have an array of new buildings, fuel storage, and machine shops as well. If you do go out to the Beaufort Airport, which is on the same property, I'm sorry to say you will not see the hangar from World War II, because unfortunately the base's new state-of-the-art hangar as of 1943 would burn to the ground on November 10th, 1943, just after they deactivated the Civil Air Patrol base, the Coastal Air Patrol base. A mechanic welding a brake cable would accidentally ignite the aircraft's gas tanks, and the ensuing destruction, fueled by the wind and dry timber, would result in the loss of about $40,000 worth of equipment, the hangars, the pilot's house, the mess hall, 4 different aircraft, and unfortunately for all historians involved, the base's official records were all destroyed in one foul swoop. But we do have some fun stories that they did put out yearbooks for these different bases. So I'm able to share with you some fun stories that came out of these bases and that were documented by the people that were based there. They refer to these 2 stories of moments of humor or terror. One of them was documented by flight observer Jess Sapp from Concord. He described how he almost had to take a swim in the Atlantic on a mission out of Manteo. He said it was his only near ditching, came on a routine patrol about 25 miles offshore when a pilot buddy told me to fly our plane while he had his sandwich and Coke. As usual, he popped open the cap against something on the dash, except this time his hand slipped and the bottle accidentally hit the ignition switch and the engine quit dead at about 700 or 800 feet in the air. Startled by the sudden silence and not realizing what he'd done, he hit everything in sight and finally the ignition, and then the engine started right up. But for a few moments, they were both quite terrified, as he described it. I imagine the guy probably got an official bottle opener after that. We also have another great story that I wanted to share that came out of the Beaufort Airport. They say, so the Beaufort pilot, Lieutenant Leonard H. Lindquist, chuckled at the antics of some of the base's pilots, noting a trick where the pilot of the faster of the 2 patrol planes, because remember they always flew 2 at a time, would come up behind the slower plane and put his wingtip over the other one's wingtip and give it a gentle tap. On one of his flights, Lindquist suspected his sister ship or his sister plane of attempting this maneuver, so he and his co-pilot trimmed up their aircraft and staged a mock fist fight in the rear of the cabin. So they climbed both into it and pretended to be pounding on each other. And that way, when the other plane came up to do the little tap, they would look in and see them having this fake fist fight and then back off on it. All jokes and antics. Missions were obviously filled with danger. It wasn't all good humor like what we just saw. Fuel exhaustion, mechanical failure, bad weather, all were threats that these men had to overcome. Sometimes men had to overcome their own anxiety to the point that they would become sick. We know from, according to Base 21's official history, they state that you often saw the men bend over to lose their breakfast before they climbed into their planes. But not once did you hear of these patrols failing to carry out their missions. Here in Beaufort, we had 3 that would make the ultimate sacrifice. You can see them here. Lieutenant Cherry Jr., he was the first to make the ultimate sacrifice from this coastal patrol base on November 16th, 1942. He was 19 years old at that time. While escorting a convoy, 19-year-old Lieutenant Guy Cherry Jr. of Kinston experienced engine failure just before 11 a.m. Unable to start the engine, the men crashed and floated alone until 2:15 p.m. So about 3 hours they were in the water before other Beaufort planes found them 15 miles off of Cape Fear, now Oak Island. lighthouse. Due to the rough seas, a Navy flying boat could not land to rescue the men until the evening. Navy personnel rushed both aviators to Cherry Point Naval Air Station Hospital, but unfortunately, Lieutenant Cherry had been dead for hours. Grove had actually strapped the other pilot in the plane with him had actually strapped the young pilot's body to his back to keep him afloat. Coroners listed the official cause of death for Lieutenant Cherry as drowning and exposure, and for his selfless act, the gentleman that had Grove, who had tied the body to his back, actually got the Blue Merit Award. The other two that you see here would go down in the same plane. The deaths of Captain, so we have Captain Lindquist and Steve Williams on June 27th, 1943. The statement that I found about this was, I was watching the day we lost two men in the same plane I'd just flown on patrol. It was one of those strutless Cessnas, a bright red job with 165 HP Warner Super Scarab engines, and man, was it fast. When my observer and I were out there, both the engine and the radio had been acting up, so I brought her in. So the plane had been acting up already. They brought it in. After work was done, Captain Leonard Lindquist, our engineer officer, and Steve Williams, one of our radio technicians, went out for a check ride. Lindquist was a very skilled pilot who had flown in air shows and I think had served in the First World War. When he got to the end of the runway, he pulled up steeply, hung the plane on its prop, and just then the engine quit and they pitched straight down into the ground. It seemed like it happened in slow motion. I was standing on the runway waiting, thinking I'd take the plane out again as soon as they returned. I ran up there and was the first man to reach the crash, but both men had been killed instantly. So the deaths obviously would weigh heavy on them at the base and add to that anxiety of going out, but it didn't stop any of them, which is very noteworthy. Manteo Beaufort's daily coastal patrols involved more than just anti-submarine missions. The U.S. Navy or Coast Guard would commonly call on small aircraft to escort convoys up and down the East Coast, passing the convoy off between base aircraft and providing an aerial shepherd to deter attacks. CAP air crews radioed back to base any signs of flotsam, patches of oil, human remains, or suspicious objects, with the messages then relayed to military authorities. They, in turn, could dispatch blimps from Elizabeth City, patrol an aircraft from Cherry Point, or patrol bases from, or patrol boats from Moorhead, Ocracoke, or Norfolk to investigate. Military authorities often requested CAP air crews to survey and chart wrecks off of shipwrecks off of sunken vessels, posing risks to navigation. Sea mines also posed a constant threat to civilian and military vessels, and not all of them were of German origin. The American Navy installed a minefield of 2,635 mines under Cape Hatteras to provide a protected anchorage for slow-moving convoys at night. Occasionally, a mine would break free and pose a threat to merchant ships. The military records officially credit the North Carolina CAP with finding 3 of these errant mines. Search and rescue missions for civilian and military personnel were also a specialty of our coastal patrol bases. Upon spotting survivals, CAP aircraft would circle overhead to try and lift the spirits of the people below and let them know they've been found. And then they would contact the U.S. Navy or Coast Guard vessels, which would arrive to officially pull them out of the water. Of the 7 merchant vessels that sank off of North Carolina's coast between August 1942 and August 1943, the CAP aircraft were credited with spotting 4 of them. So they were very effective. Despite the absence of they unfortunately never got the official title of having sunk a U-boat. During the existence of North Carolina's 2 Civil Air Patrol bases, U-boats managed to torpedo only 2 vessels, the tanker Pan Am and the gunboat USS Plymouth on the state's coastline. This is compared to the 74 vessels sunk and 16 damaged before the CAP bases operated. This record establishes the legacy of life saved by the cargoes and safely delivered to fight and win the war. Unfortunately, at dusk on August 31st, 1943, all Civil Air Patrol coastal patrol bases ceased operations as CAP was officially transferred into the War Department and became part of the Army Air Force. The men and women at Beaufort and Manteo shut down their bases and went their separate ways. Some transferred to the CAP tow target base in Driver, Virginia, to help the Navy with aerial target practice, while others continued to contribute to the Allied war effort in a variety of other ways. On May 11th, 1942, the Air Medal was established initially for use by all branches of the United States military. It is both a combat and non-combat award for meritorious achievement while participating in aerial flight. It is awarded for single acts of merit or sustained operations against the enemies of the United States. The Civil Air Patrol defined sustained operations as at least 200 hours of flight over water, which was a lot more strict than what the Navy, where they described it as 100 hours over water. So they were holding their own people to much higher standards than even the active military. Although the award was originally meant for merit, it could also signify acts of valor. And the Civil Air Patrol veteran pilots were awarded the medal beginning, 824 Civil Air Patrol veteran pilots were awarded this medal beginning on April 14th, 1948. Of the 824 pilots recognized, 74 of them came from North Carolina bases. So we definitely had a great contribution there. Thank you for listening in on me. I know that was a lot of information. I hope that I've helped to highlight. This is some of the information that some of the sources I got. And then I'll introduce you to one last, I see someone taking a picture, so I don't want to. So both bases had official mascots. They both had their own dogs. This one is Curly from the Beaufort base. And then the Manteo base had one that they named Skeeter off after the mosquitoes that they were battling on a daily basis. So I don't have a picture of Skeeter though. But thank you again for joining me today. I hope you're able to join us for the upcoming talks that we have later this month. And have a great day. And let me know if there's any questions. And I kept it to an hour.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, you forgot your glasses, ma'am. Ma'am? Are these yours?
Yes.
I was you'd have gone outside and gone, what's going on? That's when I noticed, so.
Blackout.
Initially,
I get to do this presentation another 3 or 4 times this summer.
Yeah, coming up in Hatteras too, right?
Yeah, Hatteras, and I've got a couple libraries that are wanting it. I was like, okay, I had to polish this up a little bit, so I'm doing a little less reading of the screen.
That's a lot of info though,
Yeah.
especially because there's a lot of, not just dates, but stats and stuff.
Yeah, and it's important stats.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many that I cut out because I was like, I'm never gonna remember all of this.
That's a good presentation.
Well, thank you. And I figured anything with a puppy was success. And that's what I did this for Derek yesterday. I was like, so what do you think? And he goes, it's too long, cut the dog. And I was like, no,
I was like, that dog is too cute.
how am I gonna cut Curly out?
Yeah. Really.
Well, Curly had his own slide, because there's this really cool story about how they also started their own softball team in Manteo, and they were playing against all the different Air Force bases in the area. And at one point, the commander there got so aggravated that the pilots were more focused on softball than flying. He said, I'm gonna dunk you in the sound 3 times and only drag you out twice if you go back to practice. And then they won the next game. So I think it means they went back to practice.